Okay, hi guys. Right, we're sort of finishing off the module on energy, and sort of the final bit of this is really looking at global energy issues, and really looking at the ethical and environmental issues surrounding energy use. So rather than the sort of scientific part of it, but look at the other aspects of global energy issues, because really what the specification wants you to be able to do is to recognise that while science has the ability to identify environmental issues, it doesn't always have the power to deal with the issues due to political, social, ethical or economic issues. And if we're going to look at sort of some of those issues, some of the sort of the things that cannot be solved by science, because science can, doesn't mean it will be able to or should. And a quick quote to start us off really from the film Jurassic Park in 1992. This is Dr. Ian Malcolm. And discussing the idea of making genetically modified dinosaurs, because your scientists were so preoccupied about whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And science has got a role to play in solving global energy issues. However, science isn't the only factor at play. If you think about the sort of the pandemic at the moment, there are significant concerns and issues surrounding the pandemic that aren't just purely scientific. So the government talk about following the science, and now talking about listening to the science, but of course there are other factors that they have to consider, economic factors, social factors, and all those sort of things. So there are things that science cannot solve in the energy crisis or energy concerns that we need to sort of really have a look at. So you've got a sheet which has loads of information on, and you have a table to fill in, and that's kind of what you're going to do. But the factors that affect energy supply, there's 4 different factors, right? There's physical factors, there's economic factors, there's political factors, and there's technological factors. And so these factors are not to do with the science. There's nothing to do with the science there. They are really sort of more to do with society in general. So this is on your sheet as well, but some of the physical factors are filled in. Obviously, you've got unequal distribution. So fossil fuels, for example, some countries have more resources, some have fewer resources. An example of this is oil. Oil in the Middle East is a significant amount of the global oil, which provides us with petrol and diesel and lots of other resources. Whereas in Britain we have very little, a little bit off the North Sea coast, but other countries have very little at all. So those are significant problems. Some of them are very hard to get to. So, for example, there's quite a lot of oil that is in very remote parts of Alaska that's going to be very, very difficult to get to. So you've got other considerations as well. For example, variations in climate and geography. You're not going to build a hydroelectric power station in the middle of a desert because there's not enough water for that to happen. And also things like natural disasters that might cause damage to those things. You've got economic factors, particularly cost. Cost is a great one. If you've got sort of non-renewable sources, they're getting more expensive to get. There is still coal buried under Great Britain. We closed the coal mines down in the 80s. We're looking at sort of reopening a few selectively because the cost of coal now makes it economically viable to mine it, whereas for a long time it wasn't. So we've stopped doing that. There's currently an all-time low on the price of crude oil because during the lockdown, significantly fewer people using cars, significantly less demand for petrol. That's had a massive effect on oil prices. So building things like wind farms, building things like hydroelectric power stations, they're very expensive. So again, there's a sort of barrier there in economic terms. I think if we all had loads of spare cash, we could all argue putting a wind turbine in the back garden and putting solar panels on the roof would be brilliant. But you haven't got the money to invest. That's a difficult thing to do. The technological factors. Some things are just too difficult to get hold of. There's oil reserves that in certain parts of the world that are very difficult to get hold of. But we've also got developing nations that cannot access certain technologies. So, for example, Niger has a huge sort of reserves of uranium, but is not technologically developed enough to be able to produce nuclear power stations safely. So that's a resource that they cannot then use for energy. But there's also political factors as well. So, for example, there's like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accord. That's reducing, or hopefully is reducing the demand for fossil fuels because people realise how environmentally damaging it is. There's a huge amount of public opinion against burning fossil fuels. But you get countries that have got significant political instability, countries who are not perhaps as peaceful as we like or as democratic as we like, that we have to deal with in order to get certain resources. And the Gulf War in the 90s was for the Western nations to liberate the country of Kuwait that was invaded by its neighbour Iraq. And the reason we did that isn't entirely humanitarian. It was because they were a significant supplier of oil to us. So there was a real sort of commitment there on our part to basically preserve our oil reserves. And even to this day, we deal with countries that have less than perfect civil rights records. We have countries that do not have the same equality as we value. For example, Saudi Arabia, who don't necessarily treat everybody with the same level of equality that we would expect or like, yet we deal with them because they are a huge oil producing nation and it's in our interests to do so. So there's all sorts of political factors as well. So let's just quickly whiz through a few of the different types of producing energy and look at some of the factors that aren't necessarily scientific. So for example, wind energy. So we all know that it's free, effectively. The wind blows because the earth gets heated up by the sun and you get convection currents from that, and that effectively gives us energy. It's very, very clean, but again, this is down to technology. There's a huge amount of technology in a wind turbine, which makes it expensive, and if you can't afford to buy one or you can't afford to put them everywhere, then that's a significant problem. That does reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, which is a very good thing. However, it's dangerous to wildlife. Some wildlife, particularly bats, find the difference in air pressure around air turbines very, very damaging, and it causes significant damage to their ears, and they can die as a result. Now, that's not really a scientific point of view, but that is very much in the forefront of a lot of people's minds. They're noisy as well. They do make quite a lot of noise, and then they're arguably a bit of an eyesore. So if we were sort of trying to think about putting wind turbines all over the mountains in Snowdonia, a lot of people would be very upset because that's an area of outstanding natural beauty. Now, so these are all significant issues that really aren't to do with science. They're more to do with other influences. And if you're asked an exam question on sort of this sort of topic, chances are what you're going to be asked is to look at different considerations and talk about things that science alone cannot answer. Can you identify things that will have a certain political considerations, geographical considerations, things that aren't to do with science? You know, how would people feel about this? Not how does it work? Look at nuclear. Nuclear is a very contentious sort of power source, and it's a particularly contentious power source because if it goes wrong, the effects can be catastrophic. And nuclear power stations have got an incredibly good safety record, but do bear in mind there have been nuclear incidents in the past. There was the 3 Mile Island incident, which happened back in the 60s or 70s, I can't remember. There was Chernobyl, which was 1986 off the top of my head, and more recently the Fukuyama in Japan that very nearly went into meltdown. And nuclear power stations are safe, but if it goes wrong, it can go very badly wrong. And looking at sort of when we do get a meltdown, that's obviously very, very problematic. Real advantage is it's very cheap to run, and it's not intermittent. They run all the time, so you're going to end up with a steady supply all the time. The downside is nuclear waste is a significant environmental concern, and lots of people are worried about it. So there's political sort of problems associated with it as well. So nuclear power stations have got a lot of pros and cons that really are not specifically science driven. I'll give an example of this, a slightly odd example, but the nuclear power station Sellafield up in the Lake District, the dome that goes over the reactor chamber was designed to withstand the impact of a Boeing 747, just on the off chance a plane were to crash on it. After the instances in 9/11, where 2 planes were used as weapons, they had to revisit the designs for nuclear power stations because nobody had ever considered the possibility of 2 planes crashing into a power station, because that was unlikely to happen, because no one had ever considered somebody might weaponise them. Fossil fuels, right, fossil fuels is particularly politicised one, mainly oil, because certain countries have lots of oil, certain countries don't, and that has really governed the political map of the last 50, 60 years. If you look at the Middle East and you look at nations dealing with other nations, you look at some of the richest people in the world, they are either people who work in the oil industry or who are in the sort of government of oil-rich nations, or are sort of these oligarchs. Talk about sort of Russian billionaires, oligarchs. They've made their money from oil after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Obviously, there are environmental considerations. It's non-renewable. That will lead to increased conflict if we are relying on it and it starts to run out. Right, hydroelectric. Hydroelectric is sort of a really good one because it's very reliable. We use it to make up the shortfall in the national grid. So at certain points of the day when we don't have enough electricity, we open up a hydroelectric dam, and that generates large amounts of energy very quickly. And then in the early hours of the morning, when we have lots of spare energy because all the other power stations are still producing, and no one's using it, then we can use the electrical energy to pump that water back up again. So they're safe, they're very flexible, they're really good. There are environmental consequences though. Obviously they lead to flooding in certain areas. If we have sort of tidal hydroelectric, or we have sort of hydroelectric flowing, that can cause problems to aquatic ecosystems. So there's environmental concerns associated with that might offset any green offsetting that they produce. And also, if there's a drought, they'll stop working. If there isn't enough water for them to function, they won't work. So there's all sorts of considerations that aren't specifically science. So what I want you guys to do is really to fill in that sheet. So I'll put on the physical one sort of things you might want to put on there. Feel free to write in what you want, but use the information on the sheet to fill in the bits at the bottom. But I really just want you to understand that there are global energy issues and that they are based on numerous factors: physical factors, economic factors, political factors and technological factors that really don't have anything to do with the science. If you're asked a question on it, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for what isn't science. Which of these is a problem that's not something that science can solve on its own. Okay, we can't make crude oil. We can't make crude oil sort of owning nations more democratic using science. That has to be a political point. Okay, guys. So fill that in. Keep it for your notes. Any questions, comments, queries, or concerns, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I'll see you all soon.